We are on Module 4, Part 3, Managing vCenter Inventory. In the last section, we installed vCenter Server. And then after vCenter Server is installed, you would typically create and manage virtual machines and ESXi hosts. You can connect to vCenter Server using the vSphere desktop client or using the vSphere web client. Let's just review connecting to vCenter Server using the desktop client. We click on the vCenter Server, the vSphere desktop client, then we type in the IP address of the vCenter Server followed by the administrator name, which is administrator, not root, at vSphere.local, followed by the password. Then we click on login, and now we can access vCenter Server using the vSphere desktop client. Another way to go is to use the vSphere web client. The vSphere web client allows us to manage the vCenter Server over the internet. Furthermore, it allows us to implement new features such as virtual machine hardware version 11. Now let's talk about managing vCenter Server inventory. After you install vCenter Server, the first thing you do is you create a data center, then you add hosts, then you create virtual machines. So I will connect to the vCenter Server by typing in the IP address of the vCenter Server, and I click on Login to the web client, and then I type in the administrator name followed by the password, and then I click on Login. And now I'm connected to the vSphere web client. The next thing to do is to create a data center. What is a data center? A data center is the primary container of inventory objects such as hosts and virtual machines. So what we are going to do is to create a data center and to add ESXi hosts. I select my vCenter Server, I right-click, I select New Data Center, and I will call it Data Center 1. Then I will click on OK, and there's my data center. And then the next thing to do is to add an ESXi host. So I right-click on the data center, I select Add Host, and then I type in the IP address of the ESXi host that I want to manage. Click on Next. Then I type in the administrator name, which is root, because root is the administrator name for a particular ESXi host. Administrator is the administrator name for vCenter. And I type in the password followed by Next. I accept this host followed by Next. I could add a license right now, but we will take care of that later, followed by Next. We can now configure lockdown mode. If we configure lockdown mode strictly, then that means the host can only be accessed through vCenter Server. It can't be accessed through the vSphere desktop client, and it can't be accessed through the direct console user interface. So I am not going to implement lockdown mode just yet, followed by Next. It will be installed on Data Center 1, and then we click on Finish, and now we can see that this ESXi host has been added to this data center on this vCenter Server. And then I could add several ESXi hosts, and now you can see I have 3 ESXi hosts in my data center on my vCenter Server. So what we just did, or rather what we can do now, is to use the vSphere web client to create a virtual machine. And we will see that creating a virtual machine using the vSphere web client is very similar to creating virtual machines using the vSphere desktop client. You create the virtual machine, you install the operating system, you install VMware tools, and you assign the server name and IP address. It's very similar, but it's different in some ways as well. So let's do it. I go to the vSphere web client homepage, and then I click on hosts and clusters. I select the ESXi host that I want to create the virtual machine on. I right click and select new virtual machine followed by new virtual machine. I select create new virtual machine followed by next, and then I'll give the virtual machine a name such as file server 1. Then click on next. I specify the ESXi host onto which it will be installed followed by next. I specify the data store that it's going to be stored on, and I only have one data store, so that's an easy decision. Then I click on next. Then I can select backward compatibility with older versions of ESXi. In the vSphere desktop client, they called this virtual hardware version and virtual machine hardware version, and they called this, the latest version was virtual hardware version 11, and that's compatible with ESXi 6. Since that's what we will be using, we will select the latest version. Then click on next. Then we specify the operating system that we are going to install, such as Windows 2008 Server 62-bit, followed by next. Then we can assign CPUs. I could assign 24 virtual CPUs. I will just assign 2. And then under memory, you can see it's already been assigned 4 gig of RAM, and 4 gig of RAM is sufficient. Under virtual hard disk, I will change the virtual hard disk space, and I will allocate 80 gig as virtual hard disk space. And if we click to the little triangle to the left of new virtual hard disk, and if we expand that, we can then see that we can select the disk provisioning method. And we like to use the thin provisioning method, because with the thin provisioning method, it doesn't really use up any space on the data store until data is actually saved to the virtual hard disk. Thin provisioning gives us more disk space in the short term, and we will select that followed by next. Then we can see it will create a virtual machine called file server 1 on data server 1. There's the IP address of the host. It will have 2 CPUs, 4 gig of RAM. It will have 1 network interface card, and you notice in this wizard, it didn't really ask us much about the network interface card, but in the vSphere desktop client, it did. We will be assigned the large-scale integration logic serial attached storage SCSI controller, which, if you recall, we had to select that in the vSphere desktop client. It's just the default here. So we click on Finish, and now we can see that file server 1 has now been created. If I go to Actions and select the drop-down and select Power, I can now power on this virtual machine. Let's take a look at it. To go to the virtual machine console, I can right-click on that virtual machine and select Console. And when I do, it takes us to the console of the virtual machine. Notice it opens a new tab across the top. I'm looking at the console of the virtual machine. And we can see an error message that says operating system is not found, and that's because we have created the virtual machine, but we have not yet installed the operating system. So the next thing to do would be to insert the Windows installation DVD into the DVD drive on the ESXi host to complete our installation. Or we could install Windows by configuring the virtual machine to boot from an ISO. And as you know, an ISO is a file which appears to a virtual machine as if it were a DVD. So let's configure the virtual machine DVD drive to read from an ISO. To do that, we go to the virtual machine, right-click, and select Edit Settings. And then under CD-DVD drive, we expand that, and under Client Device, we select the drop-down and select Data Store ISO file. Then we select Browse, and we select the data store, and we select the folder which contains the ISO file for the Windows installed DVD. Then we click on OK. then don't forget to click on the checkbox that says Connect at Power On. Then we click on OK. And then we can go to the virtual machine and either restart it or power it on again. And then if we go and open the console, we now see that it is reading from the install DVD, and it's now installing Windows Server from the DVD. Starting Windows, and now we see the Windows installation program. So to install Windows Server, I will click on Next, and then I will select Install Now, and then setup is starting. Then I will select the edition of Windows that I want to install. In this case, I will just select the standard edition, followed by Next. I will accept the licensing agreement, followed by Next. And we typically do not select Upgrade, we typically select Custom, and this allows us to install a new copy of Windows. We select that, and then we select the 80 gig virtual hard drive that we previously created, followed by Next. And then we can see that the files are being copied from the ISO installed DVD to virtual hard disk on the virtual machine. And it completes the installation, and then it reboots, and the system reboots, and it says user's password must be changed the first time you log in. So I click on OK. I assign an administrator password. I confirm that password. Click on OK. It says the password has been changed. And now you can see I am logged on to the Windows 2008 server, which is installed on the virtual machine. If I go back to the tab that says the vSphere web client, I can see there's my virtual machine, which has 2 CPUs and 4 gig of RAM and Windows 2008 server. But notice, VMware Tools is not installed on this virtual machine. So to install VM Tools, we click on Install VMware Tools, and what that does is it mounts the VMware Tools ISO to this virtual machine, so we can then install VMware Tools from this ISO. I go back to the virtual machine, and you can see it has recognized the install ISO for VMware Tools. I click on the Setup program, and now you can see Welcome to the Install Wizard for VMware Tools. And of course this works just the way we did it in the vSphere desktop client. I click on Next, select Typical Install, followed by Next, click on Install, and it proceeds to copy all the files necessary for VMware Tools. Completed the VMware Tools Setup Wizard, click on Finish. Now it has to reboot. I click on OK, shuts down, reboots the system. To hit Control-Alt-Delete, I click on this button on the upper right-hand corner for Control-Alt-Delete. I type in the administrator's name, followed by Next, and now I am logged in to that Windows server. If I go back to the tab for the vSphere web client, we can now see that VMware Tools has been successfully installed. And then the next thing to do is to assign a host name and a static IP address, and you already know how to do that. You go to the virtual machine and you select computer name, provide computer name, click on change, then we assign a host name such as file server 1, we assign a DNS suffix such as ccbcmd.edu, we click on OK, and it wants to reboot, but I don't want to reboot just now. I will restart later. Then I will go under Configure Networking, and I will select Networking Properties, and under TCP/IP, I will assign a static IP address. I will assign an IP address and a subnet mask and a default gateway and a preferred DNS server, just as I would configure any Windows Server. And after I've configured those variables, I click on Shutdown, or rather Restart, and then I restart the virtual machine, and it reboots, and it starts back up. And then to hit Control-Alt-Delete, I click on the button that says Send Control-Alt-Delete on the upper right-hand corner, type in the administrator name, and now I am successfully logged in to the Windows Server. So what we did was we used the vSphere web client to create a virtual machine, to install the operating system, to install VMware tools, and to assign a server name and IP address. Now let's talk about organization, using data centers and folders to organize your virtual network infrastructure. Data centers correspond to geographic sites, and folders tend to correspond to departments. So here at the Community College of Baltimore County, we have three main geographic sites: Catonsville, Dundalk, and Essex, and there is a data center at each campus. So let's create a data center for each campus. I select my vCenter server, and then I right-click and select New Data Center. And I will call the first data center Catonsville, and I will create another data center, and I will call it Essex. And then I will create a third data center, and I will call it Dundalk. 3 data centers, 1 for each main campus. And then within the data centers, we have departments: math, computer science, history, English, and science. So we create folders within the data center. What we do is I will go to the Catonsville data center, and if I right-click on that, I can select New Folder. I will select New Folder, and I will call that folder, for example, Computer Science, followed by OK. And then what I can do is I can create a folder for each department. So you can see I've got a folder for Computer Science, English, History, Math, and Science. Now let's look at configuring vCenter server, configuring time synchronization using the network time protocol, assigning licenses, and looking at services. First, let's go to time synchronization. If I go to the vSphere web client homepage and select hosts and clusters, I will select an ESXi host, and on that ESXi host, I will select Manage, and under Manage I will select Settings, and under Settings I will select Time Configuration. If I click on Edit, I could simply type in the correct time right now. Or what I could do is have this ESXi host sync up with a network time protocol server. So what I will do is I will type in the IP address of the network time protocol server at NIST, the National Institute of Standards, which is 129.6.15.28, and then I will configure that service to start up when the host starts, so the host will be configured with that network time server. Assigning a license key to vCenter server. When you first install vCenter server or ESXi or anything from VMware, it's good for 60 days. And then after 60 days, you got to either reinstall it or assign a license key. So to assign a license key, we go to the vSphere web client, and under Home, under Administration, we select Licensing. To add a license, I click a little green plus, and then I type in the license key followed by Next. I give a name to that license, such as License 1, followed by Next. Then I click on Finish, and you can see I have now added a license for the VMware vSphere 6 Enterprise Plus. Services. Let's look at the services that are running. If we go to the homepage of the vSphere web client and we select System Configuration, Under System Configuration, under the Nodes Health, we can see that no nodes have any critical error messages or warnings, and that one node is in good health, and that under Services, 0 services show any critical errors or warnings, and that we have 16 services which are running and they are in good health. And then if we select the services, we can see there's the vCenter service, and there's the VMware vSphere Web Client service, and here is the VMware ESX Agent Manager service. Now let's talk about the ESX Agent Manager. We have these services running on the ESXi host and on vCenter server. Now the first service is called the host D, or the host daemon service. It runs on the ESXi host, and what it does is it manages operations on the ESXi host. The VPX daemon runs on the vCenter server, and it communicates with the VPXA, that is to say, the agent on the ESXi host. The VPXA, the agent on the ESXi host, receives communication from the VPX daemon on the vCenter server, and it forwards those commands to the host D, which manages the operations of the ESXi host. So, if the vCenter server cannot communicate with the ESXi host, what you might want to do is to restart that service. To restart a service, you click on Action and then you select Restart. Module 4, Summary. In this module, we talked about vCenter Server, and we installed vCenter Server on a Windows server in a virtual machine. Then we looked at the vCenter Server appliance, and we installed the vCenter Server appliance. Then we installed the vSphere Web Client, and we used the vSphere Web Client to manage the vCenter Server inventory. And this concludes Module 4. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.